Number 1, Orenthal James Simpson, a football legend turned defendant in what would become the most watched legal proceeding in television history, a case that laid bare the racial, socio-economic, and celebrity fault lines running through American society in the 1990s. Born in San Francisco in 1947, O.J. Simpson rose from a troubled youth in the Potrero Hill housing projects to become a collegiate football star at the University of Southern California, winning the Heisman Trophy in 1968, before embarking on a record-breaking career in the National Football League and later transitioning into Hollywood acting and sports broadcasting. By the early 1990s, Simpson was widely regarded as a charismatic, universally beloved figure, a black man who had achieved unprecedented crossover success in white corporate America, pitching products like Hertz rental cars and appearing in films like the Naked Gun franchise, cultivating an image of affability and effortless charm that made his eventual entanglement in a brutal double homicide all the more incomprehensible to the public. Beneath this polished exterior, however, Simpson had a documented history of domestic violence against his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, whom he had married in 1985 after leaving his first wife, Marguerite. Police had been called to the Simpson residence on multiple occasions during the late 1980s and early 1990s, responding to reports of violent arguments, physical assaults, and stalking behavior, with one particularly chilling 911 call in 1989 capturing Nicole's terrified voice as she pleaded for help while O.J. could be heard screaming in the background. Yet despite this extensive paper trail of abuse, Simpson faced minimal legal consequences, receiving only a slap on the wrist in the form of community service and a fine, a reflection of the systemic reluctance of the criminal justice system to treat domestic violence as a serious felony in that era. The marriage finally dissolved in 1992, but the toxic dynamic between the two continued as Simpson exhibited obsessive, controlling behavior, stalking Nicole, showing up uninvited at her home and at restaurants, and harassing her new boyfriends, creating an atmosphere of persistent dread that would culminate in an explosion of violence on the night of June 12, 1994. Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ronald Goldman, a 25-year-old waiter at the nearby Mezzaluna restaurant who had simply stopped by her Brentwood condominium to return a pair of sunglasses her mother had left at the restaurant, were found brutally slaughtered on the walkway outside her front door, their bodies discovered shortly after midnight by a neighbor who stumbled upon the horrific scene while walking his dog. The crime scene presented a tableau of almost unfathomable brutality. Nicole, 35 years old, was nearly decapitated, her throat slashed so deeply that the wound extended to her spine, while Goldman, who had apparently arrived at the condo at the worst possible moment and was forced into a violent struggle, suffered multiple stab wounds to his chest, abdomen, and thighs, his throat also cut. His body left in a pool of blood that soaked the pavement and indicated a ferocious, protracted fight for survival. Los Angeles Police Department detectives, including the first responder Robert Risk and later lead investigators Tom Lang and Philip Van Adder, arrived to find a chaotic scene marked by a bloody left-hand glove near Goldman's feet and a matching right-hand glove discovered later that night on the grounds of Simpson's Rockingham estate, just a few hundred yards away, along with a trail of blood drops that seemed to trace a path from the murder scene back toward Simpson's property. The investigation moved with startling speed when, rather than treating Simpson strictly as a grieving ex-husband, detectives drove to his estate in the early hours of the morning to inform him of the murder, a decision that would later be severely criticized as a tactical blunder, as they found Simpson not at home but having just landed at Los Angeles International Airport on a red-eye flight from Chicago, where he had been attending a Hertz promotional event, a trip he claimed was planned well in advance. When detectives entered Simpson's Rockingham estate without a warrant, accompanied by his friend and house guest Cato Kalin, they discovered the infamous bloody glove on a narrow path behind a guest house, along with blood spots on the driveway and inside the foyer of the main house, and a Bronco vehicle parked outside with blood smears on the door and a bloody fingerprint on the interior handle, a constellation of circumstantial evidence that, combined with Simpson's lack of a verifiable alibi for the time of the murders and his documented history of violence toward Nicole, led investigators to formally name him as their primary suspect. What followed was a surreal, internationally televised low-speed chase on June 17, as Simpson, accompanied by his childhood friend Al Cowlings, fled in the white Bronco along the freeways of Los Angeles while millions of viewers watched from helicopters overhead. the fugitive holding a gun to his own head and threatening suicide as a traumatized nation looked on. An unprecedented spectacle that blurred the lines between news, entertainment, and a national psychodrama, setting the stage for a trial that would commence in January 1995 and completely hijack the collective consciousness of the country. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorneys Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, assembled a forensic case that appeared, on its surface, to be overwhelming, DNA evidence, then a relatively new and poorly understood science for the general public, placed Simpson's blood at the crime scene, the victim's blood in his Bronco and his home, and his blood inside the bloody glove found at his estate, with state-of-the-art testing by the California Department of Justice and private laboratories, indicating that the odds of the blood belonging to anyone other than Simpson were in the billions to one. The prosecution also presented a wealth of circumstantial evidence, including Simpson's history of domestic abuse, which they argued demonstrated a clear pattern of escalating violence and possessive obsession that culminated in a final, lethal act of control when Nicole refused to take him back, and they called witnesses who placed Simpson near the scene or contradicted his accounts of his movements that evening. However, the defense team, a legal dream team assembled with Simpson's vast wealth that included the brilliant and charismatic Johnny Cochran, the meticulous forensic expert F. Lee Bailey, the DNA skeptic Barry Scheck, and the prolific legal strategist Robert Shapiro, mounted a devastating, multi-pronged attack on the prosecution's case that exploited every vulnerability, every procedural misstep, and every simmering tension in Los Angeles at that time. The defense's most lethal weapon was the exposure of Los Angeles Police Department Detective Mark Furman, the officer who had discovered the bloody glove at Simpson's estate and who had testified under oath that he had not used a racial slur in the past 10 years, only for the defense to produce tape recordings in which Furman used the most vile racial epithets dozens of times and bragged about planting evidence to frame suspects, a revelation that allowed the defense to paint the entire investigation as a racist conspiracy orchestrated by corrupt, bigoted officers willing to fabricate evidence to destroy a successful black man. The defense also aggressively attacked the integrity of the DNA evidence, highlighting sloppy evidence collection procedures at the crime scene, questioning the chain of custody of blood samples, and suggesting that a police technician had mishandled and possibly contaminated the blood evidence, muddying the scientific waters just enough to create reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury that was largely unsophisticated in the complexities of genetic forensics. And then there was the moment that arguably sealed the trial's outcome, when the prosecution, in a stunning miscalculation, asked Simpson to try on the bloody gloves in front of the jury, and Simpson appeared to struggle and contort his hands in a visible effort to make the gloves fit, leading Johnny Cochran to deliver his immortal, devastating rebuke to the jury, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." A rhyming sound bite that distilled months of complex legal and scientific arguments into a single, unforgettable phrase that resonated with a jury already deeply skeptical of the police narrative. On October 3, 1995, after less than 4 hours of deliberation over a trial that had lasted 9 months and produced 126 witnesses and over 1,000 exhibits, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, a seismic shock that ripped through the nation, exposing a profound racial divide in the perception of the criminal justice system, as polls showed that a vast majority of black Americans, who had endured centuries of systemic police brutality and institutional racism, believed the verdict was a correct repudiation of a corrupt system, while a majority of white Americans were horrified and convinced that a guilty man had literally gotten away with murder. The legal saga did not end with the criminal trial, as the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman subsequently filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit against Simpson in Santa Monica Superior Court, where the burden of proof was lower and the jury was predominantly white, and in February 1997, after a much shorter and less theatrical trial, a civil jury unanimously found Simpson liable for the deaths and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages, a judgment that stripped him of his wealth and assets but could never restore the lives of the two people he was accused of destroying. The broader implications of the Simpson case were staggering and enduring, as it forced a national reckoning with the epidemic of domestic violence, prompting significant legislative changes and increased public awareness about the lethal dangers of intimate partner abuse, while simultaneously exposing the deep fissures of race, class, and celebrity privilege that warped the administration of justice in America. serving as a grim reminder that the truth in a courtroom is often less about what actually happened and more about what a skilled lawyer can convince a jury to believe. Orenthal James Simpson spent the subsequent years in a state of public disgrace and legal limbo, shunned by the Hollywood and corporate establishments that had once celebrated him, and he was eventually sentenced to 33 years in prison in 2008 for an unrelated armed robbery and kidnapping conviction in Las Vegas, from which he was paroled in 2017, living out his remaining years in relative obscurity in Las Vegas until his death from prostate cancer in April 2024, leaving behind a legacy that remains one of the most polarizing, dissected, and debated in the history of American criminal justice, a case that will forever stand as a cultural touchstone of the 1990s, a moment when the entire world stopped to watch a trial that revealed as much about the observers as it did about the accused. Number 2, Colin Pitchfork, a seemingly unremarkable young man whose double rape and murder of 2 schoolgirls in the English Midlands would inadvertently revolutionize the global landscape of forensic science, transforming the criminal justice system forever and establishing DNA profiling as the most powerful investigative tool of the 20th century. Born in March 1960 in Bristol, England, Pitchfork grew up in the small town of Newbold Verdon in Leicestershire, leading an outwardly normal life that offered no external indication of the profound sexual violence and psychopathic rage simmering beneath his placid, unassuming exterior. He worked as a baker's assistant and later in a local factory, married a woman named Carol in 1981, and fathered 2 sons, presenting himself to his neighbors and community as a quiet, devoted family man who blended seamlessly into the rural, conservative fabric of Leicestershire society, a mask of normalcy that allowed him to move through the world without attracting the slightest suspicion from those around him. The first manifestation of his depraved criminal impulses occurred on the evening of November 21, 1983, when 15-year-old Linda Mann, a bright and popular student at Narborough High School, set out from her home to visit a friend's house but never arrived, her body discovered the following morning by a hospital porter walking along a secluded footpath known as the Black Pad, a dark, tree-lined lane that cut through open fields near the village of Narborough. Linda had been brutally raped, strangled, and left partially stripped in the mud, her clothing disarranged and her body bearing the horrific physical signatures of a violent sexual assault, and despite an exhaustive police investigation that involved interviewing thousands of local men, collecting hundreds of voluntary blood and saliva samples, and utilizing the rudimentary forensic techniques available at the time, including traditional blood grouping and enzyme analysis, the case went cold, leaving Linda's family and the terrified local community without answers or justice for nearly 3 agonizing years. The nightmare repeated itself with sickening precision on July 31, 1986, when another 15-year-old girl, Dawn Ashworth, a shy and gentle student who lived in the neighboring village of Enderby, went out to walk to her grandmother's house and vanished, her body discovered 2 days later in a wooded area near a psychiatric hospital known as the Carlton Hayes Hospital, less than a mile from where Linda Mann had been found. Dawn had been subjected to an almost identical pattern of horrific violence. She was raped, sexually assaulted with a foreign object, and strangled with such force that her face was battered and bruised, and the grim similarities between the 2 crimes immediately led Leicestershire Constabulary to conclude that the same predator was responsible, unleashing a wave of panic and hysteria across the region as parents locked their children indoors and the police faced mounting public pressure to catch a killer who was clearly operating with impunity in their midst. In a desperate and ultimately tragic attempt to solve the case, the police focused their attention on a 17-year-old local boy named Richard Buckland, a mentally challenged young man with a history of behavioral issues who worked at the psychiatric hospital near where Dawn's body was found and who, after hours of aggressive interrogation without a solicitor present, eventually confessed to Dawn's murder but vehemently denied any involvement in Linda Mann's death, a discrepancy that troubled the investigating officers even as they prepared to charge him. It was at this critical juncture that the course of criminal history was permanently altered, as the investigating officer, Detective Chief Superintendent David Baker, reached out to Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a brilliant young geneticist at the University of Leicester who had recently published a groundbreaking paper describing a technique he had invented called DNA fingerprinting, a method of analyzing specific regions of human DNA that varied wildly between individuals and could produce a unique Genetic barcode that could conclusively link biological evidence to a specific person with a degree of accuracy that had never before been possible. Dr. Jeffries examined the semen samples recovered from both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, along with a blood sample from Richard Buckland, and his results were nothing short of revolutionary. The DNA profiles from the two murder victims were an exact match, confirming irrefutably that the same man had killed both girls, but Buckland's DNA profile did not match either sample, proving with absolute scientific certainty that the boy's confession was entirely false and that the police had the wrong man, a revelation that not only exonerated Buckland and spared him a catastrophic miscarriage of justice but also demonstrated, in a single, stunning stroke, the unprecedented power of this new technology to separate the guilty from the innocent. Emboldened by this breakthrough, the Leicestershire Police, in collaboration with Dr. Jeffries and the Home Office, launched the world's first ever mass DNA screening operation in 1987, a monumental and unprecedented logistical undertaking in which every male aged 17 to 34 living in the villages of Narborough, Enderby, and the surrounding areas, a total of approximately 5,000 men, were asked to provide blood or saliva samples so that their DNA profiles could be compared against the killer's genetic signature. The operation, codenamed Operation Eagle, was a massive undertaking that required setting up mobile testing stations in schools and community centers, deploying hundreds of officers to coordinate the collection and cataloging of samples, and investing enormous public resources in a technique that was still largely unproven on such a vast scale, and as the months dragged on and sample after sample failed to produce a match, the investigation began to stall, sapping public morale and raising doubts about whether the killer had simply slipped through the geographic dragnet or had never lived in the area at all. The breakthrough finally came through an act of breathtaking audacity that could have been lifted from a crime novel, when a man named Ian Kelly, a baker who worked at the same factory as Colin Pitchfork, overheard conversations in a local pub in which other men were discussing how they had avoided giving a DNA sample by using various excuses or simply ignoring the police requests, and Kelly, who had already provided a sample on behalf of his friend Pitchfork by pretending to be him, realized that the police might eventually catch on to the deception. Kelly had impersonated Pitchfork by presenting a forged passport with Pitchfork's photograph at a testing station, providing a saliva sample under Pitchfork's name, a ruse that temporarily kept Pitchfork off the police's radar, but when Kelly was later arrested for an unrelated minor offense and mentioned the deception to a fellow inmate, who in turn informed authorities, the entire elaborate facade began to crumble. Police arrested Colin Pitchfork on September 19, 1987, at his home in Newbold, Verdon, and when scientists at the Forensic Science Service compared his authentic DNA sample to the genetic profile extracted from the semen recovered from Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, the result was a perfect, unequivocal match, confirming with a certainty of 1 in several billion that Colin Pitchfork was the monster who had raped and strangled 2 innocent schoolgirls and terrorized a community for 4 years. During police interrogation, Pitchfork confessed to both murders, providing chilling, clinical details about how he had stalked his victims, forced them into secluded areas, raped them, and strangled them with his bare hands, and he also admitted to a third previously unreported sexual assault on a 22-year-old woman in 1985, revealing a pattern of predatory behavior that had been hidden behind his facade of domestic respectability. His trial at Leicester Crown Court in January 1988 was a landmark event in legal history, as Dr. Alec Jeffries testified as an expert witness, explaining the science of DNA profiling to a jury that was hearing about this revolutionary technology for the first time, and his testimony was so compelling and irrefutable that the defense offered no challenge to the scientific evidence, focusing instead on mitigating factors related to Pitchfork's psychological state. On January 22, 1988, Colin Pitchfork was found guilty of 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of rape, and 1 count of indecent assault, and Mr. Justice Park sentenced him to life imprisonment with a recommended minimum term of 30 years, a sentence that reflected the extreme gravity of his crimes and the profound terror he had inflicted upon an entire community. The impact of the Pitchfork case extended far beyond the confines of a Leicestershire courtroom, as it immediately catalyzed a global revolution in forensic science, prompting police forces and governments around the world to adopt DNA profiling as a standard investigative tool and to begin establishing national DNA databases that would allow law enforcement to compare crime scene evidence against the genetic profiles of millions of convicted offenders and criminal suspects. In the United Kingdom, the case directly led to the creation of the National DNA Database in 1995, which became the first and largest such database in the world and has since been used to solve hundreds of thousands of crimes, and similar databases were subsequently established in the United States through the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, and in dozens of other countries, fundamentally transforming the way criminal investigations are conducted and making it exponentially more difficult for violent offenders to evade detection and capture. The case also had profound ethical and legal ramifications, sparking intense debates about privacy rights, genetic surveillance, and the potential for DNA databases to be used for purposes beyond criminal justice, questions that continue to resonate today as genetic genealogy and familial DNA searching techniques, which trace suspects through the DNA of their relatives, are being used to solve cold cases that were previously considered unsolvable. Colin Pitchfork remained incarcerated in the British prison system for over 3 decades, becoming eligible for parole in 2021 after serving his minimum term, only to have his parole application rejected by the parole board after a hearing in which members concluded that he continued to pose an unacceptable risk to the public, a decision that was welcomed by the families of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, who have spent decades living with the knowledge that their daughters were robbed of their futures by a man who hid his monstrous nature behind a perfectly ordinary face. The legacy of the Pitchfork case is a complex and enduring one, a testament simultaneously to the darkest depths of human depravity and to the extraordinary capacity of human ingenuity to develop tools that can pierce through the darkness and bring the perpetrators of horrific crimes to justice, ensuring that the names Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth will forever be linked not only to a senseless tragedy but also to a transformative leap forward in the global pursuit of truth, accountability, and the protection of the innocent. Number 3, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a quiet, unassuming factory worker from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, whose arrest in 1991 revealed one of the most horrifying and medically grotesque series of crimes in American history, a 17-victim killing spree characterized by necrophilia, dismemberment, cannibalism, and the preservation of human remains that shocked the conscience of the entire world and forced a profound reckoning with the boundaries of criminal depravity and the systemic failures of law enforcement. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Dahmer was the eldest son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, a middle-class couple whose tumultuous, deeply unhappy marriage created an environment of profound emotional neglect and psychological instability that would profoundly shape their son's dark inner world from a very early age. As a young child, Dahmer exhibited disturbing behavioral patterns that alarmed his parents and teachers, including a fascination with dead animals, as he would collect roadkill, dissect the carcasses with butcher knives, and dissolve the flesh in chemicals using a makeshift laboratory he set up in a toolshed behind the family home, morbid experiments that his father, a research chemist, initially dismissed as a normal, if somewhat intense, scientific curiosity but which were, in retrospect, chilling rehearsals for the horrors that would consume his adult life. Dahmer's adolescence was marked by increasing isolation, heavy alcohol abuse that began when he was just 14 years old, and a dawning awareness of his own homosexual impulses, desires that he found deeply shameful and terrifying in the context of a socially conservative 1970s Midwest, and this toxic brew of repressed sexuality, substance dependency, and emotional detachment festered throughout his teenage years, leading to an increasingly vacant, deadened affect that masked a growing obsession with dominance, control, and the possession of another human being. His first killing occurred on June 18, 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation, when he picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, lured him to his parents' empty house with the promise of drinking and listening to music, and then, when Hicks attempted to leave, bludgeoned him to death with a barbell, strangled him, and buried the body in a shallow grave behind the house before later disinterring the remains, smashing the bones with a sledgehammer, and scattering them in the woods, a crime that went undetected for nearly a decade and demonstrated that Dahmer had already developed the core methodology of his future murders, luring a vulnerable victim to a private space, neutralizing them, and then meticulously disposing of the evidence while preserving trophies of the encounter. After a brief, disastrous stint in the United States Army, from which he was discharged for alcoholism, and a series of dead-end jobs and failed attempts at reintegration into normal society, Dahmer moved to Milwaukee in 1982 and eventually settled into a small, one-bedroom apartment at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, a grim, low-rent building in a marginalized neighborhood where the constant comings and goings of transient residents and the pervasive atmosphere of urban decay provided the perfect cover for his escalating predatory activities. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer embarked on a sustained campaign of murder that claimed the lives of 16 more victims, overwhelmingly young, vulnerable men, many of them African American, some of them teenagers, who were drawn from the margins of society, including runaways, sex workers, homeless individuals, and men struggling with addiction. Populations that law enforcement and mainstream society have historically treated as invisible and disposable, a grim reality that Dahmer exploited with cold, calculating precision. His method was terrifyingly consistent. He would frequent gay bars, shopping malls, and bus stops in Milwaukee and Chicago, approaching potential victims with an unthreatening, almost painfully awkward demeanor, offering them money, alcohol, or a place to stay, and then luring them back to his apartment, where he would drug their drinks with sedatives such as triazolam or halcyon, rendering them unconscious before strangling them, a process that he refined over the years into a grim, almost industrial routine. What distinguished Dahmer from other serial killers, and what elevated his crimes to a level of horror that transcended even the most extreme boundaries of criminal pathology, was what he did to his victims after they were dead. He would photograph the corpses at various stages of dismemberment, creating a grotesque visual archive of his crimes, and then systematically butcher the bodies using power tools, including a chainsaw and a drill, in the cramped bathroom of his apartment, carefully separating the flesh, organs, and bones, storing body parts in plastic containers and bags filled with formaldehyde in his refrigerator and freezer, and boiling skulls in a large stockpot on his kitchen stove to remove the flesh and preserve the clean, white bone as trophies. He engaged in acts of necrophilia with the corpses, attempted to create a zombie-like state in some living victims by drilling holes into their skulls and pouring boiling water or hydrochloric acid directly into their brains, a grotesque experiment born of his desperate, pathological desire to create a completely compliant, permanent sexual partner who could never leave him. And he consumed the flesh and organs of several of his victims, an act of cannibalism that he later explained to investigators was driven not by hunger but by a delusional belief that by ingesting the bodies of his victims, he could somehow absorb their essence and make them a permanent part of himself. The sheer scale of the horror unfolding behind the closed door of apartment 213 was almost incomprehensible, yet the signs were there, ignored or dismissed by a constellation of individuals and institutions who failed to connect the dots. Neighbors complained for months about the unbearable stench of rotting meat and the constant whirring of a power saw emanating from Dahmer's apartment at all hours of the night, smells that were variously attributed to spoiled food, a broken sewer line, or the building's general state of disrepair. A 14-year-old Conorak synthesumphone, the younger brother of a boy Dahmer had previously assaulted, actually escaped from Dahmer's apartment in May 1991, naked, bleeding, and deeply disoriented from the acid Dahmer had poured into his head wound, only to be returned to Dahmer's custody by 2 Milwaukee police officers who responded to a 911 call from concerned neighborhood women, dismissing the incident as a domestic dispute between 2 drunken homosexual lovers and literally handing the traumatized boy back to the serial killer who would murder him hours later, a failure of police competence and compassion so egregious that it sparked outrage across the city and led to a federal civil rights investigation. Dahmer's reign of terror finally ended in the early hours of July 22, 1991, when a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards, whom Dahmer had lured to his apartment with the promise of $50 to pose for photographs, managed to escape after being handcuffed and threatened with a knife, fleeing into the street with a pair of handcuffs still dangling from one wrist and flagging down a passing police cruiser, leading officers to return to the Oxford Apartments where they made the grisly discovery that would cement Dahmer's place in the annals of infamy. Inside apartment 213, police found a charnel house of horrors, a human head in the refrigerator, 3 more heads in a freezer, multiple torsos stored in a vat of formaldehyde, severed genitalia preserved in jars, a collection of Polaroid photographs documenting the dismemberment process in horrifying detail, and human remains in various stages of decomposition scattered throughout the small living space. A scene of such concentrated, industrial-scale butchery that it left even veteran homicide detectives physically ill and profoundly shaken. During subsequent interrogation, Dahmer confessed to all 17 murders with a calm, detached demeanor that was almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves, providing detectives with a detailed, methodical account of each killing, his motivations, and his techniques, and he later pleaded guilty but insane to 15 counts of first-degree murder in Wisconsin, arguing that his compulsive need to kill and his inability to control his impulses were the product of a severe, untreatable mental illness that rendered him incapable of conforming his behavior to the requirements of the law. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer in January and February 1992 was a media spectacle of almost unparalleled intensity, drawing journalists from around the globe to a Milwaukee courthouse that was transformed into a fortress under heavy security, as the prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, argued that Dahmer was fully aware of the wrongfulness of his actions, pointing to his meticulous efforts to conceal his crimes, his attempts to evade police detection, and his calculated selection of vulnerable victims who were unlikely to be missed, while the defense, represented by Gerald Boyle, called a parade of forensic psychiatrists who testified that Dahmer suffered from necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, and a schizotypal personality disorder that created obsessive, delusional beliefs about the nature of death and human connection. The jury rejected the insanity defense after deliberating for just 5 hours, finding Dahmer sane on all counts, and on February 17, 1992, Judge Robert Crawford sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, totaling 936 years, a sentence that was essentially a symbolic guarantee that he would never walk free again, though it provided little solace to the families of the victims who had been subjected to the agony of learning the full, horrific details of how their loved ones had died. Dahmer was subsequently extradited to Ohio, where he pleaded guilty to the 1978 murder of Stephen Hicks and received an additional life sentence, before being transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility where he spent his remaining years under constant surveillance, confined to protective custody for his own safety amid credible and persistent threats from other inmates who viewed him with a mixture of hatred and disgust that transcended even the normal hierarchy of prison violence. On November 28, 1994, just over 2 years into his sentence, Dahmer was attacked and killed in a prison bathroom by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver, a diagnosed schizophrenic who claimed that God had told him to kill Dahmer, and a third inmate, Jesse Anderson, beating both men to death with a metal bar from a piece of exercise equipment, a violent end that sparked a complex public reaction, with some expressing grim satisfaction that a monster had met a monster's fate, while others lamented that the deaths denied the victims' families the opportunity to see Dahmer face the full, slow weight of his punishment over decades of incarceration. The Dahmer case had a profound and lasting impact on multiple dimensions of American society, as it exposed the catastrophic consequences of systemic bias in law enforcement, demonstrating with devastating clarity how the disappearances and deaths of marginalized, predominantly black and brown men were treated with a casual indifference that allowed a serial killer to operate with impunity for years in plain sight, and it prompted the Milwaukee Police Department to undergo sweeping reforms in its handling of missing persons cases and its interactions with the LGBTQ community. It also ignited a fierce and ongoing debate about the nature of evil, the limits of the insanity defense, and the ethical responsibilities of the media in covering sensational crimes, as the wall-to-wall television coverage of the Dahmer trial, with its relentless focus on the most grotesque details of the murders, was criticized by many as exploitative and dehumanizing to the victims and their families, reducing their lives and deaths to a morbid spectacle for public consumption. Jeffrey Dahmer's name remains, nearly 3 decades after his death, a cultural shorthand for the darkest extremes of human behavior, a reminder that the most unimaginable horrors can unfold not in distant, war-torn landscapes but in the apartment next door, behind a locked door, in the heart of an ordinary American city, hidden in plain sight by a man who looked and sounded like anyone else until the door was finally opened and the truth was revealed to a world that was not, and could never be, prepared for what it found inside. Number 4, Pamela and Smart, a 22-year-old media coordinator at a New Hampshire high school whose calculated manipulation of a teenage student into murdering her husband became one of the most sensational and morally disturbing criminal cases of the early 1990s. A story that seemed tailor-made for the burgeoning 24-hour news cycle and that raised profound and unsettling questions about the boundaries of adult authority, adolescent vulnerability, and the terrifying power of psychological coercion. Born on August 16, 1967, in Miami, Florida, Pamela grew up in a conservative, Catholic household before her family relocated to New Hampshire, where she attended high school and later graduated from the University of New Hampshire with a degree in communications, landing a job as a media services coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton, a position that placed her in daily contact with teenagers and gave her access to the school's sophisticated video production equipment, a role that fed her considerable vanity and desire for attention while placing her in a position of perceived authority over impressionable young students. In 1989, she married Gregory Smart, a 24-year-old insurance claims adjuster whom she had met through mutual friends, and the couple settled into a modest condominium in Derry, New Hampshire, a suburban town about an hour north of Boston, but the marriage quickly deteriorated behind closed doors, as Pamela later claimed, though her assertions of physical and emotional abuse were never independently verified and were strongly contested by Greg's family and friends, who painted a very different picture of the relationship, describing Greg as a quiet, kind, and devoted husband who was desperately trying to save a marriage that his wife had already decided to destroy. In early 1990, Pamela began an illicit sexual relationship with William Flynn, a 15-year-old freshman at Winnicott High School who had been recruited to help out in the school's television studio where Pamela worked, a boy who was by all accounts socially awkward, intellectually unremarkable, and painfully susceptible to the attentions of an attractive older woman in a position of authority, a vulnerability that Pamela exploited with a cold, calculating precision that belied her youth and inexperience. The relationship between Pamela and Billy Flynn was not a conventional case of a predatory adult grooming a passive child, but rather something far more complex and psychologically insidious, as Pamela systematically dismantled Flynn's emotional boundaries, isolating him from his peers and family, convincing him that their relationship was a profound, transcendent love that was misunderstood and persecuted by a cruel and hypocritical world, and gradually reshaping his self-image from an insecure teenager into a devoted soldier in a private war against her husband, whom she portrayed as an abusive monster who was preventing them from being together. Pamela's manipulation extended beyond Flynn to include a small circle of his teenage friends, most notably Vance Lattime Jr., Patrick Randall, and Raymond Fowler, boys who were drawn into Pamela's orbit through their loyalty to Flynn and their own desire to feel important and connected to an exciting, secretive adult world that offered them a sense of power and belonging they lacked in their ordinary lives, and she skillfully played on their adolescent bravado, their insecurities, and their desire to prove themselves, gradually shifting the conversation from abstract complaints about her unhappy marriage to concrete discussions about how Greg Smart could be removed from the picture permanently. The plan that eventually crystallized was chilling in its simplicity and in the ease with which these teenagers were induced to participate in a cold-blooded murder. Pamela provided Flynn with a map to the Smart condominium, ensured that Greg would be home alone on the night of the attack by telling him she had a school meeting to attend, and waited in her car at a nearby shopping plaza while Flynn, accompanied by Patrick Randall, who carried a knife, and Vance Lattime, who provided the murder weapon, a hollow-point bullet-loaded handgun stolen from his father's bedroom safe, entered the condominium through a patio door that Pamela had deliberately left unlocked. On the evening of May 1, 1990, Billy Flynn shot Gregory Smart in the head as the 24-year-old man sat in a recliner in his own living room, watching a Boston Celtics playoff game on television, a single, devastating gunshot wound that ended his life instantly and robbed him of any opportunity to defend himself, understand what was happening, or even comprehend that the woman he had married had orchestrated his execution with the casual, calculated precision of a military tactician dispatching a target. The investigation into Greg Smart's murder initially focused on a possible robbery, as the crime scene had been staged to look like a break-in, with drawers pulled out and items scattered, but detectives Daniel Pelletier and Charles Murphy of the Derry Police Department quickly became suspicious of Pamela's behavior during their initial interviews, noting that her emotional responses seemed rehearsed and inauthentic, that she appeared more concerned with managing the narrative around her husband's death than with grieving his loss, and that she had offered implausible explanations for her whereabouts on the night of the murder. The breakthrough in the case came not from forensic evidence or brilliant detective work, but from the inherent instability and loose lips of the teenage conspirators, as Billy Flynn, Vance Laptime, and Patrick Randall, unable to bear the weight of their secret and lacking the sophistication or discipline to maintain their silence under police pressure, began to crack within weeks of the murder, confessing their roles in the crime and, crucially, implicating Pamela Smart as the architect and mastermind of the entire plot. The confessions provided by the teenagers painted a devastating portrait of Pamela as a master manipulator who had used a combination of sexual favors, emotional blackmail, and psychological conditioning to transform ordinary, if troubled, high school students into instruments of murder, and they were corroborated by a wealth of circumstantial evidence, including phone records showing extensive communications between Pamela and Flynn in the days and weeks leading up to the murder, testimony from friends and classmates who had observed the suspiciously close relationship between the media coordinator and the freshman student, and, most damningly, a series of secretly recorded conversations between Pamela and Flynn that were captured by police after the teenagers began cooperating with the investigation. Pamela Smart was arrested on August 1, 1990, approximately 3 months after her husband's murder, and charged with being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering, charges that carried a potential sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, and her trial, which commenced in March 1991 in Exeter, New Hampshire, became an unprecedented media circus that drew reporters and camera crews from every major television network in the country, transforming the small town of Exeter into a surreal spectacle of satellite trucks, press tents, and celebrity journalists jostling for position outside the courthouse. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Paul McEachern, presented a methodical, devastating case that centered on the testimony of Billy Flynn, who took the stand as the star witness and recounted in graphic, emotionally raw detail how Pamela had seduced him, isolated him from his friends and family, and systematically broken down his psychological defenses until he believed that killing Greg Smart was not only justified but was an act of love and loyalty that would cement their relationship forever. Flynn's testimony was supported by the taped conversations, in which Pamela's voice could be heard coaching Flynn on what to say to investigators, expressing frustration that the teenagers had been sloppy in covering their tracks, and making statements that strongly implied her knowledge of and involvement in the murder plot. And the prosecution skillfully wove these disparate threads into a cohesive narrative that portrayed Pamela Smart not as a battered wife driven to desperate measures, but as a cold, narcissistic, and calculating woman who had weaponized her authority and sexuality to destroy a man who stood in the way of her desires. The defense, led by prominent New Hampshire attorney Mark Sisti, mounted a vigorous counterattack, arguing that Pamela was a victim of severe domestic violence who had been driven to the brink of desperation by a husband who physically and emotionally abused her, and that Billy Flynn and his co-conspirators were not the naive, manipulated pawns the prosecution described but rather violent, rebellious teenagers who had acted on their own initiative and were now seeking to shift the blame for their own criminal choices onto a convenient scapegoat. Sisti aggressively cross-examined Flynn, attempting to portray him as a cunning, sexually aggressive young man who had pursued Pamela rather than the other way around, and he challenged the credibility of the taped conversations, arguing that they had been selectively edited and taken out of context to create a misleading impression of Pamela's guilt. But the defense's efforts were significantly undermined by the sheer volume and consistency of the evidence against Pamela, and by the fact that no credible evidence of domestic abuse was ever presented to the jury, as Greg Smart was dead and could not defend himself against the accusations his wife was making. On March 22, 1991, after approximately 13 hours of deliberation over 4 days, the jury found Pamela Smart guilty on all counts, and Judge William Fitzgerald sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available under New Hampshire law. A verdict that was met with raucous applause inside the courtroom and that reflected the jury's apparent rejection of the defense's narrative in favor of the prosecution's portrait of a Woman who had abused her position of trust to destroy a human life for her own selfish gratification. The three teenage co-conspirators all pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for their testimony against Pamela. Billy Flynn was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 18 years, Patrick Randall received 22.5 to 45 years, and Vance Laptime received 16.5 to 40 years, sentences that, while substantial, were markedly less severe than the life without parole imposed on Pamela, a disparity that sparked its own debate about the relative culpability of the architect versus the instruments of a murder plot. Pamela Smart's case had a profound cultural impact that extended far beyond the borders of New Hampshire, as it became one of the first criminal cases to be extensively covered by the new cable news networks, predating the O.J. Simpson trial by several years and establishing a template for the kind of wall-to-wall, personality-driven true crime coverage that would come to dominate television programming in the 1990s and beyond, and it inspired a 1995 HBO film titled To Die For, starring Nicole Kidman in a role loosely based on Smart, a performance that cemented the case's status as a permanent fixture in the American cultural imagination. The case also prompted important, if uncomfortable, conversations about the ethics of teacher-student relationships, the vulnerability of teenage boys to sexual exploitation by adult women in positions of authority, a phenomenon that was largely dismissed or trivialized by a society that viewed male victims of female predators through a lens of macho skepticism, and the dangers of allowing unchecked narcissism and manipulative behavior to flourish behind the respectable facade of a professional career. Pamela Smart remains incarcerated at the Beverly Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, having exhausted every avenue of appeal over the past 3 decades, including multiple habeas corpus petitions that have been systematically rejected by both state and federal courts, and she has consistently maintained her innocence, claiming that she never explicitly asked anyone to kill her husband and that the teenagers acted on their own, a position that is directly contradicted by the voluminous evidence presented at her trial, but that she has clung to with a tenacity that mirrors the same psychological rigidity and denial that characterized her behavior during the investigation. The name Pamela Smart endures in the true crime lexicon as a cautionary tale about the destructive potential of charismatic manipulation, the fragility of adolescent psychology in the face of adult predation, and the terrifying ease with which an ordinary person in a position of trust can cross the line from selfishness into sociopathy, leaving a trail of shattered lives in their wake while the cameras roll and the world watches in horrified fascination. Number 5, Susan Lee Smith, a young South Carolina mother who murdered her 2 young sons by allowing her car to plunge into a lake while they were strapped in their seatbelts, then fabricated an elaborate and emotionally devastating hoax about a fictional black carjacker to cover her crime. A case that shocked the entire world in 1994 by exposing the terrifying reality that the greatest danger a child can face is sometimes the very person who brought them into the world. Born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, a small, close-knit textile mill town in the rural upstate region, Susan Vaughn grew up in a family marked by profound dysfunction, as her father committed suicide when she was just 6 years old, an event that shattered the family and left a deep emotional void that would haunt Susan for the rest of her life, creating a desperate need for attention, validation, and male approval that would drive increasingly reckless and self-destructive choices throughout her adolescence and early adulthood. As a teenager, Susan was known in Union as a pretty, outgoing girl who was popular with boys but who also exhibited signs of deep emotional instability, engaging in promiscuous behavior, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and demonstrating a pattern of manipulative deceitfulness that alarmed teachers, counselors, and the parents of her peers. Yet these red flags were largely dismissed as typical teenage rebellion in a community where mental health services were stigmatized and virtually inaccessible, allowing Susan's underlying psychological pathology to fester and worsen without intervention. In 1988, at the age of 16, Susan became pregnant and gave birth to her first child, a son named Michael Daniel Smith, whose father, David Smith, she married in a hastily arranged ceremony that did little to address the fundamental unsuitability of the match, as David was himself a young, immature man with a drinking problem and a volatile temper who was utterly unprepared for the demands of parenthood, and the couple's second son, Alexander Tyler Smith, was born in 1991, adding further strain to an already disintegrating marriage that was characterized by loud, violent arguments, mutual infidelities, and long periods of bitter separation and reconciliation. By the summer of 1994, the Smith marriage had reached its terminal phase, with Susan and David living separately and engaging in a prolonged, acrimonious custody battle over the two boys, a conflict that was exacerbated by Susan's increasingly desperate attempts to make David jealous by flaunting relationships with other men, including Tom Findlay, the wealthy, handsome heir to a local textile fortune, whom Susan had been aggressively pursuing despite Findlay's apparent lack of serious romantic interest in her, a dynamic that set the stage for a horrific convergence of romantic rejection, maternal failure, and suicidal despair. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan left a party at the Findlay family home, where she had gone hoping to spend time with Tom but had instead been coldly rebuffed and asked to leave, a humiliation that apparently triggered a catastrophic emotional collapse, as she drove her Mazda protege to a remote boat ramp on John D. Long Lake, just outside the town of Union, with her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, strapped into their car seats. In the back seat. What happened next was a moment of almost incomprehensible evil, as Susan released the parking brake, shifted the car into neutral, and allowed the vehicle to roll down the concrete boat ramp and into the dark, cold waters of the lake, stepping out of the car as it entered the water and watching as it sank into the depths, with her two terrified sons trapped inside, their small hands pressed against the rear window as the water rose around them, a detail that Susan would later admit she could hear as she stood on the shore, the muffled sounds of her children crying and struggling as they drowned, sounds that she consciously chose to ignore as she stood by and did nothing to save them. After the car disappeared beneath the surface, Susan ran to the roadside, flagging down a passing motorist and screaming hysterically that a black man had carjacked her vehicle at a red light, forced her out of the car, and driven off with her two sons still inside, a racially explosive fabrication that was both a calculated attempt to deflect suspicion from herself and a chilling reflection of the deep-seated racial prejudices embedded in the culture of rural South Carolina, a lie that was immediately and uncritically embraced by law enforcement and the community, unleashing a massive, frenzied manhunt that effectively shut down the town of Union for 9 days. The response to Susan's story was immediate, overwhelming, and, in retrospect, deeply disturbing, as hundreds of law enforcement officers from local, state, and federal agencies descended on Union, conducting door-to-door searches, setting up roadblocks, and interrogating black men in the area with a casual disregard for civil liberties that amounted to a collective racial hysteria, while the national media descended on the small town in droves, drawn by the emotionally irresistible narrative of a helpless young mother sobbing on television, begging for the return of her babies, and pleading with a phantom carjacker to please just let her children go. Susan performed her role as the grieving mother with an Oscar-worthy virtuosity that fooled almost everyone, appearing on national morning shows, weeping openly, clutching teddy bears that had belonged to her sons, and delivering agonized monologues about how much she loved her children and how she would do anything, give anything, to have them back. A performance that was so convincing that it generated an enormous outpouring of public sympathy, including offers of financial assistance, free counseling, and even a job offer from a local businessman who was moved by her plight, all of which was built on a foundation of absolute, calculated deception. From the very beginning, however, there were small, nagging inconsistencies in Susan's story that troubled some investigators, including the fact that the supposed carjacking had occurred at a busy intersection where no witnesses had seen anything, that Susan's description of the carjacker was vague and shifting, that she had initially told investigators the carjacker had stopped at a red light, a detail that was significant because there were no red lights at the intersection she described. And that her emotional demeanor, while convincingly tearful in public, struck some experienced detectives as oddly performative and lacking in the raw, devastated authenticity that typically characterizes a parent who has just lost their children to violence. The crucial breakthrough came when investigators, having exhausted all leads in the carjacking theory and growing increasingly skeptical of Susan's account, decided to conduct a systematic underwater search of John D. Long Lake, a decision that was initially resisted by some members of the investigation who believed it was a waste of resources, but which was championed by officers who noted that the lake was along a possible route Susan could have taken on the night of the disappearances and who wanted to conclusively rule it out before moving on to other theories. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after Susan reported the carjacking, divers from the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources discovered the Mazda Protege in approximately 18 feet of water, just 50 feet from the boat ramp, with the bodies of Michael and Alex still strapped in their car seats in the back seat. A discovery that immediately and irrevocably demolished Susan's carjacking narrative and transformed her from a grieving victim into the prime suspect in a double murder investigation. Confronted with the discovery of the car, Susan's carefully constructed facade finally cracked, and under intense interrogation by seasoned investigators who pressed her on the physical impossibility of her carjacking story given the location of the vehicle, she confessed, providing a chilling account of how she had allowed the car to roll into the lake and admitted that she had fabricated the carjacker story from whole cloth, though she attempted to mitigate her culpability by claiming that the drownings were not premeditated but rather the result of a spontaneous, impulsive decision made in a moment of extreme emotional distress caused by the humiliation of being rejected by Tom Findlay and the overwhelming pressures of her failing marriage and custody battle. Susan Smith was charged with 2 counts of murder and held without bail at the Union County Jail, where she was placed on suicide watch, a decision that some critics viewed with bitter irony given that the suicide she was allegedly trying to commit at the lake had been accomplished at the expense of her 2 innocent children rather than herself, and as the reality of what she had done sank in, the public sympathy that had initially enveloped her curdled into a wave of revulsion and outrage that was unprecedented in its intensity and scope, as people across the country and around the world struggled to comprehend how a mother could look into the eyes of her terrified children as they drowned and choose to do nothing. The trial of Susan Smith commenced on July 18, 1995, in the Union County Courthouse, with the prosecution, led by solicitor Tommy Pope, presenting a devastating case that centered on the sheer premeditation and cruelty of the crime, arguing that Susan's decision to drive to a remote, unlit lake at night, to release the brake and allow the car to roll into deep water, and to stand on the shore listening to her children die rather than opening a car door or screaming for help demonstrated a level of conscious, deliberate malice that far exceeded the legal definition of impulsive behavior and warranted a conviction for murder in the first degree. Pope methodically dismantled Susan's claim of a spontaneous emotional breakdown by presenting evidence of her calculated efforts to conceal the crime, including the elaborate carjacking hoax, the rehearsal of her emotional performances before television cameras, and the fact that she had driven past the lake to the party at the Findlay home earlier that evening, suggesting that she had scouted the location and formed the plan before the supposed triggering rejection occurred, a timeline that strongly implied premeditation. The defense, led by attorney David Bruck, one of the most respected capital defense lawyers in the country, did not dispute the facts of the crime but instead argued that Susan's actions were the product of a severely damaged psyche that had been shaped by a lifetime of trauma, including her father's suicide, childhood sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, which Susan had disclosed for the first time during the investigation, and a profound, untreated depression that had reached a suicidal crisis point on the night of the murders, a convergence of psychological factors that, while not excusing her conduct, mitigated her moral culpability and made her a candidate for mercy rather than the death penalty. Bruck called a series of forensic psychiatrists who testified that Susan suffered from borderline personality disorder, major depression with suicidal ideation, and a dissociative coping mechanism that allowed her to compartmentalize the horror of what she was doing to her children, and he presented harrowing testimony about the abuse she had endured as a child, painting a portrait of a deeply wounded woman who had been failed by every adult in her life and who, in a moment of supreme psychological disintegration, had turned the destructive impulses she had always directed at herself outward onto the 2 people she was supposed to protect. The jury, after deliberating for approximately 2.5 hours, convicted Susan Smith of 2 counts of murder, but rejected the prosecution's push for the death penalty, opting instead for a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 30 years, a verdict that reflected the jury's apparent acceptance of the defense's argument that Susan's psychological pathology, while not exculpatory, was sufficiently mitigating to spare her life, a decision That was controversial, but that was ultimately seen as a humane application of the principle that even the most horrific crimes can be committed by broken people rather than irredeemable monsters. The Susan Smith case left a scar on the American psyche that has never fully healed, as it shattered the cherished, deeply held myth that maternal love is an unconditional, biological imperative that transcends all other human drives, forcing society to confront the terrifying reality that some mothers, broken by trauma, consumed by narcissism, or simply devoid of the basic human capacity for empathy, are capable of killing their own children, and it also exposed the pernicious, enduring power of racial stereotypes in criminal investigations, as the ease with which Susan's fabricated black carjacker was accepted as truth by law enforcement, the media, and the public laid bare the deep wells of racial bias that continue to distort the administration of justice in America. Susan Smith remains incarcerated at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, where she has been denied parole multiple times and will not be eligible for release until 2024 at the earliest, and while she has reportedly expressed remorse for her crimes in various interviews and prison communications, the families of Michael and Alex Smith, along with the community of Union and the millions of people who were traumatized by the case, continue to grapple with the haunting, unanswerable question of how a mother could stand on the shore of a dark lake and listen to her children drown, a question that serves as a permanent, unsettling reminder of the fragility of the bond between parent and child and the terrifying depths to which the human soul can descend when that bond is broken. Number 6, Lyle and Eric Menendez, two brothers from one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in Beverly Hills who shotgunned their parents to death in the living room of their luxurious mansion in August 1989 and then embarked on a spectacular, years-long spending spree with their inherited millions before their eventual arrest and two separate, nationally televised trials in the mid-1990s that divided the nation over the fundamental question of whether they were cold-blooded, greed-driven matricides or deeply damaged survivors of a lifetime of horrific child sexual abuse who killed in a desperate bid to stop the torment. Born in 1968 and 1971 respectively, Lyle Joseph Menendez and Eric Galen Menendez were raised in a world of almost unimaginable privilege and material abundance, as their father, José Menendez, a Cuban immigrant who had fled the revolution with nothing and had clawed his way to the top of the American corporate ladder through a combination of ruthless ambition, ferocious intellect, and an iron will, had accumulated a vast fortune through his executive roles at Hertz, RCA Records, and eventually as the CEO of Live Entertainment, a video and film distribution company that made him one of the most powerful figures in the entertainment industry. Their mother, Mary Louise Anderson, known as Kitty, was a former beauty queen from a middle-class background in Idaho who had married Jose in 1963 and had devoted herself to maintaining the family's extravagant lifestyle, which included a 17-room Mediterranean-style mansion on Elm Drive in Beverly Hills, a beach house in Malibu, luxury vehicles, designer clothing, and elite private educations for the boys at Princeton and UCLA respectively, a gilded surface that concealed a roiling underworld of family dysfunction, psychological abuse, and, according to the brothers, horrific sexual violence that would ultimately culminate in a bloodbath. The prosecution's narrative, which formed the backbone of the state's case across both trials, painted a picture of two spoiled, entitled, and deeply resentful young men who had never forgiven their father for his harsh, demanding parenting style and who had grown to hate their mother for her complicity in José's emotional tyranny, and who, after years of sponging off their family's wealth without ever achieving the personal or professional success their father demanded of them, decided that the easiest path to financial freedom was to murder both of their parents and collect their inheritance, a motive that was seemingly confirmed by the brothers' behavior in the months following the murders, during which they went on a frenzied spending binge that included the purchase of a Porsche Carrera, a Rolex watch, a restaurant in Newport Beach, luxury apartments, expensive suits, and tens of thousands of dollars spent at high-end boutiques and jewelry stores, a financial bacchanalia that looked, to any objective observer, like the behavior of guilty men who knew they had gotten away with murder and were celebrating their ill-gotten freedom. On the evening of August 20, 1989, Jose and Kitty Menendez were relaxing in the den of their Beverly Hills mansion, watching a James Bond film on television, when Lyle and Eric entered the room carrying 12-gauge shotguns they had purchased at a sporting goods store in San Diego several days earlier, and without warning, without negotiation, without any attempt to confront their parents about their grievances or to seek any kind of resolution to their familial conflicts. The brothers opened fire, discharging multiple rounds at point-blank range into their father and mother, tearing their bodies apart with a fusillade of buckshot that was so devastating that Jose was essentially unrecognizable, his face and chest obliterated by the blasts, while Kitty, who had apparently tried to crawl away from the initial volley, was shot repeatedly in the back, arms, and face, leaving a crime scene of such extreme, gratuitous violence that veteran homicide detectives were shaken by the sheer overkill of the assault. After wiping out their entire immediate family in the span of less than a minute, the brothers disposed of the shotguns, drove to a nearby gas station to establish a false alibi by buying movie tickets, and then returned home, where Lyle called 911 in a performance of hysterical grief, screaming that someone had killed his parents, a performance that initially fooled responding officers and homicide detectives, who, in the absence of any obvious suspects and confronted with a crime scene that suggested the extreme brutality of a professional hit or a mob connection given Jose's business dealings in the cutthroat entertainment industry, spent months pursuing theories that the murders had been orchestrated by business rivals or organized crime figures. The case went cold for approximately 6 months, as the Menendez brothers moved back into the mansion, threw lavish parties, traveled extensively, and continued their conspicuous consumption of their father's fortune, all while being shadowed by a growing suspicion among their friends and acquaintances, several of whom eventually contacted the police to report that the brothers had made incriminating statements about the murders during therapy sessions and private conversations, including confessions to a girlfriend and to a psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel, whose own complex involvement in the case would become a central and controversial element of the subsequent trials. In March 1990, Eric Menendez, overwhelmed by guilt and unable to live with the secret of what he and his brother had done, confessed to Dr. Oziel during a psychotherapy session, revealing in graphic detail how he and Lyle had planned and executed the murders of their parents, and Lyle subsequently confirmed the confession during a joint session with the psychologist, a disclosure that Oziel, rather than reporting to law enforcement as required by California's duty to warn statute, initially kept secret while attempting to extract financial benefits from the brothers in exchange for his silence, a stunning ethical breach that would later result in Oziel's license being revoked and that provided the defense with a powerful argument about the reliability and credibility of the prosecution's key evidence. The brothers were arrested in March 1990 and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder each, and what followed was a legal saga that consumed the 1990s, as the first trial in 1993 resulted in 2 deadlocked juries that were unable to reach a verdict, with the critical divide falling along gender lines, as female jurors, who constituted a majority on both panels, were significantly more receptive to the defense's argument that the brothers had been driven to kill by a lifetime of horrific abuse, while male jurors tended to favor the prosecution's theory of greed-driven matricide, a split that reflected a broader societal schism about the nature of domestic abuse, the credibility of male victims of sexual assault, and the limits of self-defense as a legal justification for parricide. The retrial, which commenced in 1995 after a judge dismissed the deadlocked juries and ordered the cases severed for the second proceeding, was held before a single jury and featured the same core arguments but with significantly more restrictive rulings from the bench regarding the admissibility of certain abuse evidence, a procedural shift that tilted the playing field in favor of the prosecution and ultimately proved decisive in the outcome. The defense's case, led by attorneys Leslie Abramson for Eric and Jill Lansing for Lyle, was built on a foundation of devastating testimony about the sexual, emotional, and physical abuse that the brothers claimed to have endured at the hands of their father from early childhood through young adulthood, testimony that was provided by the brothers themselves during days of raw, emotionally shattering testimony on the witness stand, as well as by a parade of relatives, family friends, former nannies, and expert witnesses who corroborated various aspects of the abuse narrative. Eric testified that Jose had begun sexually molesting him when he was approximately 5 or 6 years old, describing a pattern of abuse that included fondling, oral sex, and anal rape that continued with increasing frequency and intensity through his teenage years and into early adulthood, and he alleged that the abuse was not limited to the bedroom but was woven into the fabric of their daily relationship, with Jose using sexual dominance as a tool of psychological control, threatening Eric with physical violence if he ever disclosed the abuse and conditioning his love and approval on Eric's submission to his sexual demands. Lyle testified to a similar pattern of sexual abuse, though he described it as somewhat less frequent and more focused on physical and emotional domination, and both brothers described their mother, Kitty, as a deeply disturbed, volatile woman who was aware of the abuse but chose to ignore it, diverting her own psychological pain into alcoholism, prescription drug addiction, and a pattern of emotional cruelty toward her sons that included belittling them, comparing them unfavorably to their father, and, according to the brothers, physically assaulting them on numerous occasions. The defense also presented expert testimony from leading psychologists and psychiatrists who diagnosed both brothers with post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis that was supported by standardized psychological testing and by the brothers' reported symptoms of nightmares, flashbacks, dissociation, and emotional numbness, and they argued that the murders, while undeniably horrific, were the desperate, last-resort actions of two traumatized individuals who genuinely believed, in that moment, that their father was going to kill them to prevent them from exposing the abuse, a belief that, while perhaps objectively unreasonable in hindsight, was subjectively real to the brothers in the context of their lifelong experience of being trapped in a cycle of violence from which there was no escape. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorneys Pam Bozanik and David Kahn, mounted a ferocious counterattack on the abuse narrative, arguing that the brothers had fabricated the entire story of sexual abuse as a convenient get-out-of-jail-free card to justify a premeditated, cold-blooded double murder that was motivated purely by financial greed and a desire to escape their father's control over their lives, and they presented evidence that the brothers had carefully researched the murder plot, including the purchase of untraceable shotguns, the disposal of the weapons, the creation of a false alibi, and the immediate liquidation and spending of their inheritance, all of which demonstrated a level of planning and forethought that was utterly inconsistent with a spontaneous act of self-defense by traumatized abuse victims. The prosecution also attacked the credibility of the abuse witnesses, pointing out inconsistencies in the brothers' accounts, highlighting the fact that neither brother had ever reported the abuse to any authority figure before the murders, and suggesting that the relatives who testified on their behalf were motivated by a desire to share in the brothers' inheritance or by a long-standing resentment of José Menendez's domineering personality, rather than by any genuine knowledge of sexual abuse. On May 20, 1996, after approximately 20 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the brothers' claim of imperfect self-defense and found Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of first-degree murder on both counts, and the judge sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was mandated by California law for multiple murder convictions and that ensured that the two men would spend the rest of their natural lives behind bars, an outcome that was met with a complex and deeply divided public reaction, with some viewing the verdict as a just punishment for a calculated, greedy double murder and others seeing it as a tragic failure of the criminal justice system to adequately account for the devastating impact of childhood trauma on criminal behavior. The Menendez case remains one of the most debated and analyzed criminal cases in American history, as it forced a sustained national conversation about the hidden epidemic of male child sexual abuse, a subject that was almost entirely taboo in the early 1990s and that the brothers' testimony, regardless of its ultimate credibility in the eyes of the jury, helped to bring into the light of public discourse for the first time in a meaningful way, and it also exposed the deep limitations of the legal system's ability to handle cases where the line between victim and perpetrator is blurred by years of systemic abuse and psychological damage. Lyle and Eric Menendez remain incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County, California, where they have both married women they met through correspondence, earned college degrees, and participated in various rehabilitative programs, and their case continues to generate public interest and legal activity, as their attorneys have filed numerous habeas corpus petitions over the years alleging newly discovered evidence of abuse and prosecutorial misconduct. Efforts that have so far been unsuccessful but that reflect a persistent, if fading, belief among some supporters that the brothers were denied a fair trial by a legal system that was not yet equipped to understand or properly weigh the impact of severe childhood trauma on criminal behavior. The image of two young men in designer suits, sitting in a Beverly Hills courtroom, weeping as they described the most intimate and degrading forms of sexual violation at the hands of their own father, remains one of the most indelible and unsettling images of the 1990s, a moment that challenged every assumption the public held about wealth, violence, family, and the nature of justice, and that continues to haunt anyone who has ever looked behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect home and wondered what secrets are being kept in the dark. Number 7, Karla Homolka, a seemingly wholesome, attractive Canadian woman who participated alongside her husband Paul Bernardo in the rape, torture, and murder of 3 teenage girls, including her own younger sister, in a horrific series of crimes that unfolded in the province of Ontario between 1990 and 1992 and that ignited a firestorm of national outrage when it was revealed that Homolka had negotiated a shockingly lenient plea bargain with prosecutors before the full extent of her culpability was known, a legal debacle that became known as the deal with the devil and that profoundly and permanently transformed the Canadian criminal justice system. Born on May 4, 1970, in Port Credit, Ontario, a suburban community near Toronto, Karla Homolka grew up in a conventional, middle-class Catholic family, the eldest of 3 daughters, and by all outward appearances she was a model child and young adult, popular, bubbly, academically capable, and physically striking, with blonde hair and a vivacious smile that made her the center of attention in any room, a carefully curated exterior of normalcy and sweetness that masked a profound psychological vacancy and a disturbing capacity for depravity that would not be fully understood until years after her crimes were exposed. Homolka met Paul Kenneth Bernardo in October 1987 at a hotel restaurant in Toronto, where she was working as a veterinary assistant and he was a 23-year-old accounting student with piercing blue eyes, a chiseled jaw, and an effortless, magnetic charm that concealed a terrifying reality. Bernardo was, unbeknownst to Homolka or anyone else in his life at that time, already an active and prolific serial rapist who had been terrorizing the Scarborough area of Toronto since 1987, attacking numerous women in their homes and apartments in a spree that had earned him the media moniker the Scarborough Rapist, and that was the subject of an intense but ultimately unsuccessful police investigation that had failed to identify Bernardo despite a composite sketch that bore a striking resemblance to his actual face. Far from being repelled by Bernardo's darker impulses, however, Homolka was drawn to them with a fervor that both enabled and accelerated his descent from serial rape to serial murder, as she quickly became a willing and enthusiastic participant in his violent sexual fantasies, encouraging his escalating behavior, facilitating his crimes, and ultimately crossing the ultimate threshold from complicity to active participation in the most grotesque acts of violence imaginable. The first victim of the Bernardo-Homolka killing partnership was Tammy Lynn Homolka, Karla's 15-year-old younger sister, a sweet, trusting girl who looked up to her older sister with an adoration that Karla exploited with a cold, calculating ruthlessness that defies comprehension, as on December 23, 1990, Christmas Eve, Karla and Paul lured Tammy to the Homolka family home in St. Catharines, Ontario, where they used a combination of alcohol and animal tranquilizers soaked in a cloth that Karla held over her sister's face to render the unconscious teenager helpless, after which both Paul and Karla sexually assaulted the drugged girl while a video camera, set up by Karla, recorded the entire horrific assault. Tammy Homolka never woke up, as she aspirated on her own vomit while unconscious from the drugs and suffocated, and Karla and Paul, rather than calling for help or taking responsibility for what they had done, attempted to cover up the crime by cleaning the evidence, moving Tammy's body, and dressing her in her own bed to make it appear as though she had simply fallen asleep and choked. A ruse that succeeded in convincing the coroner and police that Tammy's death was a tragic accident caused by the accidental ingestion of alcohol and medication, a verdict that allowed Karla and Paul to walk free and continue their predatory partnership without interruption. The second victim was 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, a bright, spirited teenager from Burlington, Ontario, who, on June 15, 1991, sneaked out of her home after a fight with her parents and found herself locked out when she tried to return, a moment of adolescent vulnerability that proved fatal when Bernardo, who had been cruising residential neighborhoods looking for a victim, spotted her alone on a porch and abducted her at knife point, forcing her into his car and driving her to the home he shared with Karla in Port Dalhousie, a suburb of St. Catharines, where the couple held Leslie captive for 24 hours in a horrific ordeal of repeated sexual assault, torture, and humiliation that was meticulously documented on videotape by Bernardo with Karla's enthusiastic assistance and participation. After exhausting their violent fantasies on the terrified girl over the course of an entire day and night, Bernardo strangled Leslie Mahaffey with a length of electrical cord while Karla watched, and the couple then dismembered her body with a circular saw, encased the pieces in cement blocks, and dumped them in Lake Ontario, where they were discovered by fishermen on June 29, 1991. A discovery that horrified the community and launched a massive homicide investigation. That, despite the recovery of the remains and an intensive forensic examination, initially failed to connect the murder to Bernardo or Homolka. The third and final confirmed victim was 15-year-old Kristen French, a responsible, well-liked high school student from St. Catharines who was abducted on April 16, 1992, as she walked home from school, forced into Bernardo's car at knife point in broad daylight by Bernardo while Karla acted as a lookout and a participant in the abduction, and taken to the couple's home where she was subjected to 3 days of sustained sexual torture, degradation, and abuse that was again captured on videotape, the audio and visual recordings of which, when later discovered by police, were so horrific and disturbing that seasoned homicide detectives and forensic experts were brought to tears and required psychological counseling after being exposed to their contents. Kristen French was murdered on April 19, 1992, strangled by Bernardo, and her body, which had been washed and her hair shampooed in a final, grotesque act of post-mortem degradation, was dumped in a ditch in Burlington, less than an hour's drive from where Leslie Mahaffey's remains had been found, and her discovery on April 30 triggered a full-scale panic across the Niagara region and beyond, as the realization that a serial predator was actively hunting teenage girls in the area prompted one of the largest and most intensive manhunts in Canadian history. The investigation that finally brought Bernardo and Homolka to justice was a complex, multi-jurisdictional effort that was hampered by jurisdictional rivalries, communication failures, and a series of near misses that allowed the couple to continue killing for far longer than they should have, as Bernardo had actually been interviewed as a suspect in the Scarborough rapes as early as 1990 but was released after providing a DNA sample that, due to an extraordinary backlog at the Provincial Forensic Laboratory, was not tested against the rape kit evidence from the Scarborough cases until 1993, a delay of over 3 years that, had it not occurred, would almost certainly have prevented the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. The critical break in the case came in an unexpected and deeply ironic fashion, as on January 14, 1993, Paul Bernardo severely beat Karla Homolka with a flashlight during a domestic dispute, causing facial fractures and other injuries that required hospitalization, and while Karla was recovering in the hospital, Bernardo's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent, leading Karla, for reasons that remain a subject of intense debate and speculation, to flee their home and seek refuge with family members, who, along with Karla's attorney, encouraged her to go to the police and tell them what she knew about the murders. What followed was one of the most controversial legal maneuvers in Canadian history, as Karla Homolka, through her attorney, entered into plea negotiations with the Ontario Attorney General's office, offering to provide a full confession and to testify against Paul Bernardo in exchange for a plea of guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. With a proposed sentence of 12 years in prison, a deal that prosecutors agreed to in February 1993 based on Homolka's representation that she had been a passive, battered victim of Bernardo's coercive control who had participated in the crimes only out of fear for her own life and who had not been an active, willing participant in the violence. The profound, catastrophic flaw in this arrangement was that at the time the plea bargain was negotiated, the police and prosecutors did not possess the videotapes that Bernardo and Homolka had made of their crimes, tapes that were discovered only after the plea deal was finalized, in September 1993, hidden in a ceiling tile in the bathroom of Bernardo's home by Bernardo himself, and when investigators viewed the tapes, they were confronted with irrefutable evidence that completely shattered Homolka's carefully constructed narrative of passive victimhood, as the recordings showed her not as a reluctant, terrified bystander but as an active, enthusiastic, and creative participant in the rapes, tortures, and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, a woman who smiled for the camera, suggested new methods of torture, and demonstrated a level of depravity and agency that was entirely inconsistent with her portrayal as a coerced victim. Paul Bernardo was arrested in February 1993 and stood trial in the summer of 1995, with the videotape serving as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case and providing incontrovertible proof of his guilt, and he was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, as well as numerous counts of aggravated sexual assault related to the Scarborough rapes, and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, a sentence that was subsequently designated as a dangerous offender designation, meaning he is likely to remain incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. Karla Homolka, meanwhile, completed her 12-year sentence and was released from prison in July 2005, a development that sparked a wave of public fury and fear that was unprecedented in Canadian history, as communities across the country mobilized to protest her presence in their neighborhoods, and the case prompted sweeping reforms to the Canadian justice system, including the establishment of a formal review process for plea bargains, changes to the rules governing the disclosure of evidence during plea negotiations, and the creation of the so-called Karla law, which allowed for restrictions to be placed on the freedom of high-risk offenders after their sentences were completed. A legislative response that reflected the profound depth of public betrayal felt by a nation that had been forced to watch a willing participant in the rape and murder of children walk free after serving a sentence that was widely perceived as grotesquely disproportionate to the enormity of her crimes. The Bernardo Homolka case remains, 3 decades later, the darkest and most disturbing chapter in the history of Canadian criminal justice, a case that forced a normally placid and law-abiding nation to confront the reality that evil does not respect national borders, that the most monstrous crimes can be committed by the most ordinary-looking people, and that the legal systems designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty are operated by fallible human beings who are capable of making catastrophic errors of judgment that can undermine public confidence in the very concept of justice for a generation. The names Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, along with Tammy Homolka, are forever enshrined in the collective memory of Canada as symbols of innocence destroyed by a darkness that no system, no family, and no community could have fully anticipated or prevented, a darkness that was captured on videotape in all its horrifying, soul-destroying detail, and that will forever serve as a warning about the terrifying things that human beings are capable of doing to one another behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal suburban home. Number 8, Yolanda Saldivar, the founder and president of the Selena Quintanilla Perez fan club who shot and killed the 23-year-old Tejano music superstar at a Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi, Texas, on March 31, 1995, a senseless, devastating act of violence that silenced one of the most luminous and culturally significant musical talents of the late 20th century and triggered an outpouring of grief across the global Latino community that was compared in its scale and intensity to the morning that followed the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lennon. Born on September 17, 1960, in San Antonio, Texas, Yolanda Saldivar was the youngest of 7 children in a working-class Mexican-American family, and she spent her early adult years building a respectable, if unremarkable, career as a registered nurse at a San Antonio hospital. A profession that provided her with a steady income and a measure of social standing, but that apparently failed to satisfy a deep, consuming hunger for proximity to fame, glamour, and the transformative power of celebrity that would ultimately lead her down a path to destruction. Saldivar discovered the music of Selena Quintanilla Perez in the mid-1980s, at a time when Selena was still a rising star in the Tejano music scene, a genre of traditional Mexican folk music infused with polka rhythms and German influences that was overwhelmingly popular within the Mexican-American communities of Texas but that had not yet crossed over into the mainstream American music market, and Saldivar became an obsessively devoted fan, attending every concert within driving distance, collecting every recording and piece of merchandise, and immersing herself so completely in the world of Selena fandom that it began to consume her identity and displace the other relationships and activities that had previously structured her life. In 1991, Saldivar's fanatical devotion translated into direct contact with Selena's inner circle when she began repeatedly calling the offices of Q Productions, the family-owned entertainment company managed by Selena's father, Abraham Quintanilla Jr., requesting permission to start an official fan club, a proposal that was initially rebuffed by Abraham, a shrewd and protective former musician who recognized in Saldivar's intense, boundary-blurring enthusiasm a potential source of instability and trouble, but Selena, who was known for her extraordinary warmth, generosity, and genuine connection with her fans, overruled her father and personally authorized Saldivar to establish and run the official Selena fan club from her home in San Antonio. What appeared on the surface to be a heartwarming story of a fan being rewarded for her loyalty quickly revealed itself to be a deeply dysfunctional and ultimately dangerous arrangement, as Saldivar, once installed in the position of fan club president, began to exhibit a pattern of controlling, obsessive behavior that extended far beyond the normal parameters of fan club management and that was characterized by an escalating effort to isolate Selena from her family, to position herself as the singer's most trusted confidant and gatekeeper, and to monopolize access to Selena's time, attention, and affection in a way that was deeply unsettling to those closest to the singer. Saldivar proved to be an effective and energetic fan club organizer in the early years, growing the membership to over 20,000 members and producing a slick, professional newsletter that enhanced Selena's brand and deepened her connection with her fan base, and her efforts earned her Selena's genuine gratitude and trust, to the point that in 1994, Selena asked Saldivar to help manage her burgeoning chain of Selena etc. boutiques, a business venture that marked Selena's expansion from music into fashion and retail and that gave Saldivar unprecedented access to the singer's financial records, business operations, and personal life. It was this expanded role that provided Saldivar with the opportunity and the means to commit the financial betrayal that would unravel their relationship and set the stage for the murder, as in early 1995, Selena's family discovered that Saldivar had been embezzling money from both the fan club and the boutique operations, diverting tens of thousands of dollars into her personal bank accounts through a combination of forged checks, unauthorized withdrawals, and the manipulation of financial records, a discovery that shattered Selena's trust and prompted her to initiate a careful, methodical effort to distance herself from Saldivar and recover the missing funds without creating a public scandal. The confrontation between Selena and Saldivar over the missing money reached its critical juncture on March 9, 1995, when Selena's father, Abraham, held a meeting at Q Productions at which he confronted Saldivar with evidence of the embezzlement and informed her that she was being removed from her positions with the fan club and the boutiques, a meeting that left Saldivar furious, tearful, and deeply resentful, as she blamed Abraham for poisoning Selena against her and refused to accept that her actions constituted theft, instead characterizing them as minor accounting irregularities that could be easily resolved, a delusion that would harden into a dangerous fixation over the following weeks. Despite her father's warnings and her own growing unease, Selena, ever the peacemaker, agreed to meet with Saldivar one final time on the evening of March 31, 1995, at the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi. A meeting that Selena believed was necessary to recover financial documents and records that Saldivar had refused to return and that were essential to straightening out the accounting mess left by the embezzlement, a decision that would prove to be the last and most fatal of the many acts of generosity and trust that defined Selena's tragically short life. Selena drove herself to the motel, arriving at approximately 11:30 at night, and went to room 158, where Saldivar was staying, and what transpired inside that room over the next hour has been pieced together from Saldivar's own contradictory statements, the physical evidence at the scene, and the testimony of the motel receptionist who witnessed the final moments of the encounter, as the meeting began as a tense but seemingly non-violent discussion about the financial records, but rapidly deteriorated when Selena told Saldivar that she could no longer trust her and that their professional relationship was permanently over. According to the testimony of the receptionist, who had become concerned about the raised voices coming from the room and had gone to investigate, Selena emerged from the room shortly before midnight, stumbling and clutching her chest, screaming that she had been shot, and the receptionist looked up to see Saldivar standing in the doorway of the room pointing a chrome-plated .38 caliber Taurus revolver at Selena's back, threatening to shoot the receptionist as well before turning the gun back toward Selena, who had collapsed on the lobby floor in a rapidly expanding pool of blood, crying out for help and identifying her attacker by name. Selena Quintanilla Perez was pronounced dead at Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital at 1:05 in the morning on March 31, 1995, the victim of a single gunshot wound that had entered just below her right shoulder blade, severed a major artery, and caused massive internal hemorrhaging, a wound that was catastrophic and virtually unsurvivable even with immediate medical intervention, which was tragically delayed by the critical minutes that elapsed between the shooting and Selena's arrival at the hospital. After shooting Selena, Saldivar retreated back into the motel room, locked herself inside, and, in a surreal and agonizing standoff that lasted for nearly 10 hours, engaged in a negotiation with Corpus Christi police detectives and SWAT team members who had surrounded the motel, a negotiation that was punctuated by periods of silence, tearful phone calls to friends and family members, and Saldivar's repeated, desperate threats to turn the gun on herself, a threat that she ultimately did not carry out, instead surrendering peacefully at approximately 9:45 in the morning when a specially trained crisis negotiator convinced her to put the gun down and walk out of the room. The murder weapon, the Taurus revolver, was found inside the room, along with a suicide note that Saldivar had written but not used, and the subsequent investigation by the Corpus Christi Police Department and the Nueces County District Attorney's Office was straightforward and legally uncomplicated, as the crime had been witnessed by the motel receptionist. Saldivar had made no attempt to deny that she had pulled the trigger. And the physical evidence, including the gun and the ballistic analysis confirming that the bullet removed from Selena's body had been fired from Saldivar's revolver, left no room for any plausible defense. The trial of Yolanda Saldivar commenced on October 23, 1995, in the Harris County Courthouse in Houston, Texas, a venue change that had been granted due to the massive pretrial publicity surrounding the case in Corpus Christi, where Selena had been a beloved hometown hero and where any impartial jury pool would have been impossible to assemble, and the prosecution, led by District Attorney Carlos Valdez, presented a concise, devastating case that portrayed Saldivar as a stalker and embezzler who had murdered Selena in a calculated act of revenge after the singer discovered her theft and severed their relationship. The defense, led by attorney Douglas Tinker, mounted a legally desperate but psychologically fascinating argument that the shooting was an accidental discharge that occurred during a struggle over the gun, which Saldivar claimed she had been pointing at her own head in a genuine attempt to kill herself when Selena tried to physically take the weapon away from her, causing it to fire inadvertently. A narrative that was directly contradicted by the physical evidence, including the fact that the entry wound was on Selena's back, indicating that she was walking away from Saldivar when she was shot, and that the muzzle-to-target distance suggested a deliberate, aimed shot rather than the wild, uncontrolled discharge that would be expected during a physical struggle. The jury deliberated for approximately 2.5 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the charge of first-degree murder, and on October 23, 1995, Judge Mike Westergren sentenced Yolanda Saldivar to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, the maximum sentence available under Texas law. A verdict and sentence that were met with cheers and applause from the crowds gathered outside the courthouse and that were widely seen as a just and appropriate punishment for the woman who had stolen one of the most beloved cultural icons of a generation. The impact of Selena's murder on the Latino community and on the broader cultural landscape of the United States was profound, far-reaching, and enduring, as the singer, who had been on the verge of achieving the kind of mainstream crossover success that no Tejano artist had ever attained, with her first English-language album nearly completed at the time of her death, was transformed in an instant from a rising star into an eternal icon, a symbol of unfulfilled potential, cultural pride, and the devastating arbitrariness of violence that cut down a brilliant life at the very moment it was about to reach its fullest expression. The grief that followed Selena's death was massive and unprecedented in its scale, as an estimated 60,000 mourners filed past her open casket at the Bayfront Auditorium in Corpus Christi over a single day, a line that stretched for miles and included people of every age, background, and ethnicity who had been touched by Selena's music, her warmth, and her embodiment of the bicultural identity that defined the Mexican-American experience in Texas and across the Southwest, and radio. Stations across the country switched to all Selena formats for days, her albums rocketed to the top of the Billboard charts, and her posthumously released English-language album, Dreaming of You, debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, historic achievement for a Tejano artist that underscored the tragic irony of her murder occurring at the precise moment of her greatest commercial triumph. Yolanda Saldivar remains incarcerated at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, a maximum security prison for women, where she has become eligible for parole beginning in 2025, a prospect that has generated significant media attention and public concern, as Selena's fans and family members have expressed their vehement opposition to her release, arguing that a woman who took the life of someone so extraordinary and so universally loved has forfeited any right to rejoin. Society. The Selena Yolanda Saldivar case endures as one of the most heartbreaking and culturally significant criminal cases of the 1990s, a story that is not about the complexity of the legal proceedings or the ambiguity of the evidence, but about the terrifying destructiveness of obsessive fandom, the vulnerability of public figures to the people who get closest to them, and the irreplaceable loss that occurs when a unique, irreplaceable human being is taken from the world by an act of violence that was as senseless as it was preventable, a loss that continues to resonate every time Selena's voice fills a room and reminds those listening of everything that was stolen from her and from the world on a dark motel parking lot in Corpus Christi in the spring of 1995. Number 9, Andrew Philip Cunanan, a 27-year-old serial killer who embarked on a devastating, 3-month cross-country murder spree in the spring and summer of 1997, killing 5 men in 4 states before culminating his rampage with the assassination of world-renowned Italian fashion designer Gianni Versace on the steps of his Miami Beach mansion, a crime that fused the worlds of high fashion and homicidal violence in a moment of unimaginable horror that riveted and terrorized the entire world. Born on August 31, 1969, in National City, California, a working-class suburb of San Diego, Andrew Cunanan was the youngest of 4 children born to Modesto Cunanan, a Filipino-American serviceman who had served in the United States Navy, and Mary Ann Shalassi, an Italian-American homemaker who devoted herself to creating an atmosphere of middle-class respectability and Catholic piety that belied the deep financial insecurities and domestic tensions that simmered beneath the surface of the family's carefully maintained facade. From a very early age, Cunanan exhibited a prodigious intelligence and a magnetic, almost hypnotic social charm that set him apart from his peers and that he learned to weaponize with devastating effectiveness throughout his life, as he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of art, literature, fashion, and history, a wickedly funny and self-deprecating wit, and an uncanny ability to read people, mirror their desires, and make them feel as though they were the most fascinating and important person in any room, a constellation of social skills that allowed him to gain entry into wealthy, elite social circles that would normally have been closed to a young man of his modest background. Cunanan was also openly gay from his teenage years, coming out to his family and friends at a time when homosexuality was still deeply stigmatized in mainstream American culture and within his own conservative Catholic community, and he channeled his outsized personality and his desire for acceptance into the cultivation of a flamboyant, glamorous persona that was heavily influenced by the excess and opulence of the 1980s and early 1990s, frequenting exclusive gay bars, high-end restaurants, and luxury boutiques in San Diego and later in San Francisco, where he relocated as a young adult, and supporting himself through a combination of a generous monthly allowance provided by his father and the financial generosity of a succession of older, wealthy male lovers who were drawn to his youth, beauty, and conversational brilliance. The carefully constructed edifice of Cunanan's glamorous life, however, was built on a foundation of profound psychological instability, as beneath his charming exterior lay a deeply narcissistic, manipulative, and emotionally volatile individual who suffered from what several mental health professionals who later analyzed his case would describe as antisocial personality traits compounded by a profound fear of abandonment, a desperate need for admiration and control, and a simmering rage against a society that he felt had failed to recognize his inherent superiority and entitlement to a life of wealth, beauty, and prestige. The first cracks in Cunanan's facade appeared in early 1997, when his father abruptly abandoned the family and fled the country after embezzling a significant sum of money from his employer, a betrayal that cut off Cunanan's monthly allowance and shattered the financial foundation of his lifestyle, and simultaneously, several of Cunanan's wealthy patrons and lovers, perhaps sensing the instability beneath his polished surface or simply tiring of the relationship, began to distance themselves from him, depriving him of the social connections and financial support that had sustained his identity and his way of life. This convergence of financial ruin and social rejection appears to have triggered a catastrophic psychological collapse in Cunanan, as friends and acquaintances reported that in the weeks leading up to his killing spree, he became increasingly paranoid, despondent, and agitated, making statements suggesting that he felt his life was over and that he had nothing left to lose, a state of mind that, combined with his access to firearms, his familiarity with the vulnerabilities of the wealthy gay men in his social orbit, and his complete lack of moral restraint, created the conditions for an explosion of violence that would claim 5 lives and terrify a nation. The first victim in Conanon's rampage was Jeffrey Trail, a 28-year-old former Navy officer and close friend of Conanon's who was found bludgeoned to death with a claw hammer in the luxury apartment of David Madsen, an architect in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on April 28, 1997. A killing that appeared to have been precipitated by a confrontation between Conanon and Trail over Conanon's increasingly erratic behavior and his growing desperation for money and companionship. The second victim was David Madsen himself, whose body was discovered on May 3, 1997, on the east shore of Rush Lake in Minnesota, shot twice in the back of the head with a 9mm pistol, and the fact that Madsen had apparently been held captive by Conanon for several days after Trail's murder, forced to drive around the upper Midwest with his killer, and then executed at the lakeside when he was no longer of use, demonstrated a chilling capacity for extended psychological manipulation and cold-blooded, instrumental violence that elevated Conanon from a spontaneous killer to a calculated and highly dangerous predator. Conanon then fled to Illinois, where on May 4, 1997, just one day after killing Madsen, he murdered Lee Miglin, a wealthy 72-year-old real estate developer in Chicago, in an attack of such extreme brutality that it shocked even the most hardened homicide investigators, as Miglin was found in his townhouse garage with his face wrapped in masking tape, his hands bound with wire, his chest stabbed and slashed with garden shears and a screwdriver, and his throat cut with a hacksaw, a killing that bore the hallmarks of profound rage and personal animosity, though Miglin and Conanon had no known prior relationship, leading investigators to theorize that Miglin was a random victim selected because of his wealth and vulnerability and murdered as an act of generalized fury against the prosperous, heterosexual establishment that Conanon felt had excluded and demeaned him. After stealing Miglin's luxury Lexus and fleeing Chicago, Conanon drove to New Jersey, where on May 9, 1997, he shot and killed William Reese, a 45-year-old cemetery caretaker in Pennsville, New Jersey, a man who had no connection to Conanon or to any of the previous victims and who was apparently murdered solely because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time when Conanon needed a vehicle to continue his flight, as Conanon abandoned Miglin's Lexus, which had become too recognizable due to the intense media coverage of the killings, and stole Reese's red pickup truck, a decision that demonstrated Conanon's growing recklessness and his increasing willingness to kill indiscriminately to achieve his immediate objectives. By this point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had inserted itself into the manhunt, placing Conanon on the 10 most wanted fugitives list, a designation that reflected the Bureau's assessment that he was an extremely dangerous, unpredictable serial killer who was capable of striking again at any time and in any place. And a massive national media campaign was launched to publicize his photograph and description, transforming Conanon into a household name and generating a wave of fear and anxiety across the country, particularly within the gay community, which felt specifically targeted by the killings. For nearly 2 months after the Reese murder, Conanon vanished, leading to intense speculation about his whereabouts, his mental state, and whether he was still alive, as the trail went cold and the FBI and local law enforcement agencies chased hundreds of tips and sightings across the country without success, a period of terrifying uncertainty that was shattered on July 15, 1997, when Andrew Conanon walked up to Gianni Versace on the front steps of the legendary fashion designer's Casa Casuarina, an opulent, oceanfront mansion on Ocean Drive in the heart of Miami Beach's South Beach neighborhood, and shot him twice in the back of the head at point-blank range with the same 9mm pistol he had used to kill David Madsen 2.5 months earlier. Gianni Versace, 50 years old, was one of the most famous and influential fashion designers in the world, the founder of the Versace fashion empire, a man whose creations had been worn by princesses, supermodels, and rock stars, and whose extravagant, sexually charged aesthetic had defined the look of an era. And his assassination in broad daylight on one of the most famous streets in America was an act of violence so brazen, so cinematic in its audacity, that it sent a shockwave of horror and disbelief around the globe, dominating every news cycle for weeks and transforming the Conanon case from a regional murder story into an international sensation. Versace was walking back to his mansion from a morning errand, carrying a stack of magazines, when Conanon approached him from behind, and the entire sequence was captured by a security camera on a nearby building, footage that was broadcast endlessly on television news programs around the world and that showed, in chilling, grainy detail, the calm, deliberate manner in which Cunanan raised the gun, fired, and then walked away at a brisk but unhurried pace, as though he had simply completed an errand, an image of cold, detached lethal efficiency that became one of the most indelible and disturbing visual artifacts of the 1990s. The murder of Versace unleashed a massive law enforcement response in Miami Beach, as hundreds of local police officers, FBI agents, and federal marshals descended on South Beach, sealing off Ocean Drive, conducting building-to-building searches, and interviewing witnesses in a frantic effort to locate Cunanan before he could strike again, but the killer had vanished into the dense urban landscape of Miami, a city whose population of tourists, transients, and seasonal residents provided an almost infinite number of places to hide and made the task of finding a single determined fugitive extraordinarily difficult. For 8 agonizing days, the manhunt gripped Miami and the nation, as the FBI received thousands of tips, chased down sightings from Key West to Atlanta, and maintained a perimeter around South Beach that turned the glamorous vacation playground into an armed camp, and it was during this period that the media began to construct a narrative about Cunanan that portrayed him as a calculating, almost mythic figure. A brilliant and charming sociopath who had moved through the highest levels of society before embarking on a final, apocalyptic rampage against the world that had rejected him, a narrative that was compelling but that oversimplified the far more banal and pathetic reality of a deeply damaged individual who was lashing out incoherently at the symbols of a life he could never attain. On July 23, 1997, 8 days after killing Versace, Andrew Cunanan was found dead on a houseboat in the Indian Creek neighborhood of Miami Beach, just a few miles from the Versace mansion, having died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head with the same 9mm pistol he had used to kill 2 of his 5 victims. And the discovery of his body brought the manhunt to a sudden and anticlimactic end, denying the public the catharsis of a trial, a conviction, and an explanation, and leaving behind a vast landscape of unanswered questions about his motives, his movements during the 2 months he disappeared between the Reese and Versace murders, and the exact nature of any relationship, if one existed, between Cunanan and Versace prior to the assassination. The investigation into the Cunanan case, led by the FBI and the Miami Beach Police Department, concluded that Cunanan had acted alone and that his murder spree was driven by a combination of narcissistic rage, financial desperation, social rejection, and a desire for notoriety, a conclusion that was supported by the forensic evidence linking all 5 murders to Cunanan through ballistics and DNA, but that left many unsatisfied, as the absence of a trial meant that the deeper psychological questions raised by the case were never subjected to the adversarial scrutiny of a courtroom proceeding. The legacy of the Andrew Cunanan case is complex and multifaceted, as it exposed the vulnerability of even the most famous and wealthy individuals to random acts of violence. It highlighted the pervasive fear within the gay community during the height of the AIDS epidemic, a fear that was compounded by the perception that Cunanan's victims were primarily drawn from the margins of society or from the hidden subcultures of wealth and sexuality that existed alongside the mainstream, and it prompted a national conversation about the intersection of mental health, celebrity culture, and the destructive power of unchecked narcissism. The murder of Gianni Versace, in particular, had a profound cultural impact that extended far beyond the fashion world, as it marked the end of an era of extravagant, unapologetic glamour that had defined the 1980s and early 1990s and that Versace himself had embodied more fully than almost any other public figure. And it was widely seen as a symbolic moment in which the darkness and violence of the real world shattered the beautiful, glittering fantasy that the fashion industry had constructed and sold to the public for decades, a shattering from which the industry, and the culture at large, has never fully recovered. Andrew Cunanan was cremated, and his ashes were interred in a mausoleum at the Holy Cross Cemetery in San Diego, near the home of his mother, a quiet, unremarkable resting place for a man who caused so much death and terror, and whose name remains, nearly 3 decades later, a chilling synonym for the terrifying reality that the most dangerous predators are not always the ones who look like monsters, but sometimes the ones who look like the most charming, sophisticated, and fascinating person in the room. Number 10, the murder of JonBenet Patricia Ramsey, a 6-year-old beauty pageant contestant whose lifeless body was discovered in the basement of her family's sprawling Tudor-style home in Boulder, Colorado, on the morning of December 26, 1996, a crime so bewildering in its circumstances, so contaminated in its forensic investigation, and so explosive in its media coverage that it has remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades, transforming from a homicide case into a permanent, unresolved American obsession that has generated thousands of theories, consumed millions of hours of television coverage, and fundamentally altered the way the media covers crime in the United States. Born on August 6, 1990, in Atlanta, Georgia, JonBenet Ramsey was the youngest child and only daughter of John Bennett Ramsey, a wealthy, successful businessman who had built a fortune through his position as the president and chief executive officer of Access Graphics, a computer distribution company that was later acquired by Lockheed Martin, and Patricia Poore Ramsey, a former beauty queen and socialite who had won the Miss West Virginia pageant in 1977 and who channeled her own lifelong passion for the pageant world into the intensive grooming and preparation of her daughter for participation in child beauty pageants across the country. The Ramsey family relocated from Atlanta to Boulder in 1991, settling into a 15-room mansion at 755 15th Street, a grand, historic home in one of Boulder's most affluent neighborhoods, and they quickly integrated themselves into the social and civic fabric of the community, attending the prestigious St. John's Episcopal Church, hosting elaborate holiday parties, and cultivating an image of WASP elegance, corporate success, and domestic tranquility that made them one of the most prominent and visible families in a city that prided itself on its progressive values, its outdoor lifestyle, and its relative insulation from the violent crime that plagued larger American cities. JonBenet herself was, by all accounts, a bright, vivacious, and affectionate child who excelled in kindergarten, loved playing with her friends, and enjoyed the pageant circuit, which she had been participating in since the age of 4, winning numerous titles and crowns in regional and national competitions, though the extensive videotaped footage of her performances, in which she was dressed in elaborate costumes, wore heavy makeup, and executed practiced, adult-like routines on stage, would later become a source of intense scrutiny and moral outrage in the court of public opinion, as critics argued that the sexualization of a 6-year-old girl for the entertainment of adults created a toxic environment that somehow contributed to or explained her murder, a theory that had no factual basis but that profoundly shaped the public perception of the case. The timeline of events leading to the discovery of JonBenet's body began on the evening of December 25, 1996, Christmas Day, when the Ramsey family attended a Christmas dinner at the home of their close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, before returning to their own home at approximately 9:30 at night, at which point JonBenet, who had fallen asleep in the car, was carried upstairs to her bedroom by her father and put to bed without, according to her parents, being awakened. The following morning, at approximately 5:45, Patsy Ramsey descended the back staircase from the second floor to the kitchen, intending to prepare for a trip to Michigan to visit John's older children from a previous marriage, and as she walked through the hallway, she noticed a 2.5-page handwritten note on the spiral back staircase, a note that she picked up and read, and that would immediately and irrevocably shatter the peaceful, post-Christmas calm of the Ramsey household. The note, written on paper taken from a notepad that was found in the Ramsey home and with a pen that was also found in the kitchen, was addressed to John Ramsey and informed him that his daughter had been kidnapped by a small foreign faction that represented a group of individuals that had the capability to monitor the Ramsey home and that demanded a ransom of $118,000, a sum that was almost exactly equal to the bonus that John Ramsey had received earlier that year from his company, a precise and deeply suspicious coincidence that would become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case. The note, which at 236 words was extraordinarily long for a kidnapping ransom note, contained language that was bizarre, rambling, and at times inexplicably cinematic, as it referenced movies like Speed and Ransom, instructed John to bring the money to a location that would be provided later, warned him not to contact the police or the authorities under threat of JonBenet's immediate execution, and signed off with the phrase Victory, SBTC, a cryptic signature that has never been definitively decoded despite decades of analysis by law enforcement, amateur sleuths, and forensic linguists. Patsy Ramsey screamed for her husband, who came downstairs, read the note, and, despite the note's explicit instructions not to contact the authorities, immediately instructed Patsy to call 911, a decision that the Ramsey family has consistently maintained was the only rational response of a parent whose child has been taken, but which some investigators and critics have argued was the first in a series of calculated moves by the Ramseys to control the narrative and stage a cover-up for a crime that had actually been committed inside the home. The Boulder Police Department responded to the 911 call at approximately 5:52 in the morning, and over the course of the day, the Ramsey home, which should have been treated as an active crime scene from the very first moment, was thoroughly and catastrophically compromised by a series of breathtakingly inept procedural failures that would haunt the investigation for decades and that effectively destroyed any realistic possibility of securing a conviction, regardless of who actually committed the murder. Police officers allowed family friends who had gathered at the home to move freely throughout the house, touching surfaces, opening doors, and potentially destroying trace evidence. They failed to immediately seal the perimeter of the property, allowing people to enter and exit without being logged or searched. They did not conduct a systematic, room-by-room search of the home for hours after their arrival, and most critically, they failed to discover JonBenét's body until approximately 1:05 in the afternoon, nearly 7 hours after they had first arrived at the scene, when John Ramsey, accompanied by his friend Fleet White, decided to conduct his own search of the basement and found JonBenét's body in a windowless, rarely used storage room at the far end of a narrow, cluttered basement corridor. JonBenet was found lying on her back on the floor of the storage room, covered by a white blanket, with her wrists bound above her head with a makeshift ligature made from a nylon cord, a piece of duct tape covering her mouth, and a tightly drawn garrote around her neck that had been fashioned from the same type of nylon cord and a broken paintbrush handle that was used as a twisting device to tighten the noose. A device that was so elaborately constructed and so specifically designed for strangulation that forensic experts concluded it could not have been created accidentally or in a moment of panic, but must have been deliberately fabricated by someone with a clear intent to kill. The autopsy, conducted by Boulder County Coroner Dr. John Meyer, revealed that JonBenet had died from asphyxiation caused by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma, meaning that in addition to being strangled with the garrote, she had suffered a severe, 8.5-inch fracture to the right side of her skull, an injury that was consistent with being struck by a heavy, blunt object, and the autopsy also revealed that she had been sexually assaulted, as there was evidence of vaginal trauma and chronic inflammation that suggested prior abuse, findings that added a horrifying layer of sexual violence to an already grotesque crime and that fueled intense speculation about the motive and the identity of the killer. The contamination of the crime scene was so severe and so comprehensive that it essentially rendered the physical evidence useless for forensic analysis, as the lack of a secure perimeter meant that DNA from countless individuals who had entered the home on the morning of December 26, including police officers, family friends, and the Ramseys themselves, was commingled with any evidence that might have been left by the killer, and the failure to collect and preserve evidence in a timely and systematic manner meant that potentially crucial forensic material, including fibers, hairs, footprints, and the ransom note itself, was handled, moved, and potentially contaminated by people who had no business touching it. The investigation into JonBenet's murder was initially conducted by the Boulder Police Department, a relatively small, under-resourced municipal police force that was utterly unprepared for the forensic, investigative, and media complexities of a case of this magnitude, and their performance was characterized by a series of blunders, missteps, and questionable decisions that led to the appointment of a special prosecutor, Alex Hunter, to oversee the investigation, and ultimately to the involvement of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, though even these additional resources were unable to overcome the catastrophic damage that had been done to the case in the first critical hours. The Boulder Police Department focused their investigative efforts almost exclusively on the theory that JonBenet had been killed by a member of her own family, a theory that was based in part on the absence of any evidence of forced entry into the home, the bizarre specificity of the ransom note, the fact that the body was found inside the house despite the note claiming a kidnapping, and behavioral analysis by FBI profilers who suggested that the note's language and length were more consistent with a staging attempt by a family member than with an authentic communication from an external kidnapper. John and Patsy Ramsey were formally identified as suspects in the investigation, though they were never charged, and they were subjected to hours of police interrogation, extensive media scrutiny, and a relentless campaign of public vilification that portrayed them as everything from emotionally abusive stage parents to cold-blooded murderers who had killed their daughter in a fit of rage over a bedwetting incident and then staged an elaborate cover-up to deceive the police, a narrative that was amplified and sustained by a tabloid media machine that descended on Boulder with the ferocity of a swarm of locusts and that fed the public's insatiable appetite for salacious details about the dark underbelly of a seemingly perfect wealthy family. The Ramsey family vigorously and consistently denied any involvement in their daughter's death, hiring prominent criminal defense attorneys, conducting their own independent investigation, and waging a protracted public relations battle to clear their names, a battle that was hampered by their initial reluctance to submit to formal, recorded police interrogations under conditions set by the Boulder Police Department, a reluctance that was interpreted by many in the media and the public as evidence of guilt, but that their attorneys maintained was a perfectly reasonable response to a police department that had already made up its mind and was looking to build a case rather than find the truth. In 2003, nearly 7 years after the murder, the investigation took a dramatic turn when advanced DNA testing conducted on trace evidence recovered from JonBenét's underwear, specifically a mixture of DNA that did not match any member of the Ramsey family, was submitted to the Combined DNA Index System, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI, and the profile, which belonged to an unknown male, failed to produce a match, a development that led Mary Lacey, the Boulder County District Attorney who had succeeded Alex Hunter, to formally exonerate the Ramsey family in a 2008 letter, stating that the DNA evidence was sufficient to conclusively rule out John, Patsy, and their son Burke as the source of the DNA found on JonBenét's body and that no member of the Ramsey family was considered a suspect in the case. The exoneration was a watershed moment in the case, as it appeared to definitively clear the family of the crime that had consumed their lives for over a decade, but it was immediately complicated by the fact that the DNA evidence, while powerful, was not necessarily conclusive proof of an intruder's identity, as forensic experts pointed out that the DNA could have been deposited through innocent secondary transfer, such as during the manufacturing process of the underwear, and that the absence of Ramsey DNA on a single piece of evidence did not exonerate them if other evidence pointed toward an inside job. In 2006, the case experienced another dramatic and ultimately fruitless twist when a 50-year-old schoolteacher from Thailand named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok and extradited to the United States after sending a series of bizarre emails to a journalism professor in which he claimed to have been present when JonBenet died and described the murder in detail that he suggested was consistent with the known facts of the case, a confession that generated massive international media coverage but that completely collapsed when the DNA evidence failed to match Carr's profile and when the details of his confession were revealed to be largely inaccurate and derived from information that had been publicly available in the media for years. John Mark Carr was released without charges, and the case reverted to its status as an unsolved mystery, a designation that was formally affirmed by the Boulder Police Department in 2009, when they announced that they were scaling back their active investigation due to a lack of new leads, though they maintained that the case remained open and that they would pursue any credible new information that emerged. In 2016, 20 years after the murder, the case experienced a massive resurgence in public attention with the broadcast of a CBS documentary series titled The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, which assembled a team of former FBI investigators, forensic scientists, and behavioral analysts to conduct a comprehensive re-examination of the evidence, and which concluded, controversially, that the most likely explanation for the crime was that Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old at the time of the murder, had accidentally killed his sister, perhaps by striking her with a flashlight, and that his parents had staged the kidnapping and murder scene to protect him from legal consequences, a conclusion that Burke Ramsey vehemently denied and that resulted in a defamation lawsuit filed by Burke against CBS that was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006 at the age of 49, having spent the final decade of her life living under the suffocating weight of public suspicion and the grief of losing her daughter, and she went to her grave without ever seeing the case solved or her name fully cleared in the court of public opinion, while John Ramsey, now in his 80s, continues to live a quiet, private life and has publicly advocated for improvements in the way missing children cases are handled and for the expansion of familial DNA searching techniques that might one day identify his daughter's killer. The murder of JonBenet Ramsey remains, nearly 30 years later, the most famous unsolved homicide in modern American history, a case that has spawned dozens of books, hundreds of podcast episodes, thousands of online discussion threads, and an entire subculture of amateur sleuths who continue to analyze every available scrap of evidence in the relentless pursuit of an answer that may never come. And its enduring legacy is a deeply troubling one, as it exposed the devastating consequences of forensic incompetence, the destructive power of unchecked media speculation, the vulnerability of innocent families to the machinery of public suspicion, and the terrifying reality that in a country of over 300 million people, it is still possible for a child to be murdered in her own home in the dead of night and for no one to ever be held accountable. A reality that ensures that the name JonBenet Ramsey will forever be spoken not as a celebration of a life that was, but as a haunting question about a life that was stolen and a justice that was never served.